Divers exploring the Titanic wreckage made a spine-chilling new discovery. The limiting factor mini-sub crew is sinking well below the waves into the Atlantic. As the submarine finally reaches the seafloor, the guys on board experience something that no one has seen firsthand in 14 years. The RMS Titanic is a rusting ruin. However, when the divers inspect the Titanic's wreckage, they stumble upon a vision that sends chills down their spines. Haunting discovery. Even a century after her disaster, the Titanic continues to shock and move people. After all, the Titanic was launched to much fanfare on April 10, 1912, from Southampton, England. She was an engineering marvel, and tickets for her inaugural trip were in great demand. Disaster strikes. The ship's first port of call was Cherbourg on France's northern coast, just across the English Channel. From there, she sailed to what was then Queenstown, now Cobh, in Ireland, before heading west to New York City. 3 days later, as midnight came, disaster struck. An iceberg ripped down the ship's starboard side, placing the Titanic and all of her passengers in grave danger. Beginning of the end. Although the collision did not breach the hull, it did bend the ship's steel plates out of shape. There were gaps, and freezing Atlantic water started to stream in. The captain and crew may have survived if just 4 of the Titanic's compartments had been flooded. When 5 of the so-called unsinkable boat began to fill with water, it was the beginning of the end. Tragedy. The Titanic sank under the seas only a few hours after colliding with the iceberg. There were 2,224 people on board, and nearly 1,500 of them, men, women, and children, died in the frigid water. Around 1,000 passengers remained on board the ship as it plummeted 12,500 feet to the ocean floor. Taking a closer look. However, more than a century later, the limiting factor mini-submarine penetrated over 2.5 miles under the waters of the Titanic disaster. And what the team uncovered below in the depths brought the eerie tragedy even more into perspective. Revealing the truth. The diver's discovery is all the more heartbreaking when you realize how majestic the Titanic was. The Titanic was the second of 3 Olympic liners built. The Britannic came after her, and before the unimaginably named Olympic. All belonged to the White Star Line's fleet. And why were they constructed? That's right, plain old-fashioned corporate competition. Under the hood. White Star Line's rivals have been outpacing the corporation, and CEO J. Bruce Ismay needed to find a means to catch up. He determined that the company's future rested not in speedier ships, but in larger ones. And the company's Olympic-class behemoths would not only be the world's biggest passenger ships, but also the most extravagantly sumptuous, at least for first-class passengers. Years in the making. The Titanic's construction began in March 1909 at the Belfast shipyard at Hartland and Wolff. The whole operation took 2 years from start to finish. Despite the fact that Hartland and Wolff had been constructing ships for the White Star Line for almost 4 decades, the Olympic warships were the biggest ever built at the time. This required huge engineering accomplishments. More lives lost. For example, the Titanic's hull alone contained 2,000 steel plates. These were up to 6 feet broad, 30 feet long, and weighed up to 3 tons each. 3 million rivets kept the steel plates in place as well. And the ship's construction was very hazardous. During her construction, 8 employees were killed, while another 246 were wounded. Nothing but the best. The first-class passengers, on the other hand, were in for a treat. Those fortunate people may use the gym, a swimming pool, or a Turkish bath. They may also have roast ducks, foie gras, pâté, and peaches and chartreuse jelly at the Café Parisien. Swanky. Third-class novelties. Well, third-class passengers were plainly denied these pleasures. Circumstances aboard the Titanic were nevertheless better than on other maritime lines of the time. For recreation, there were communal areas, and youngsters could play on the poop deck. Third-class cabins with seating for 2 to 6 people also included power, heating, and running water. These were novelties at the time. A fatal flaw. The Titanic was no ordinary ship. She measured approximately 880 feet from head to stern, 175 feet from the bottom to the highest point of the funnels, and 90 feet across the beam. She also had an incredible 52,310 tons of displacement, with 29 boilers powering the engines that powered the 4 propellers. However, the Titanic only had 20 lifeboats, with a total capacity of 1,178 passengers. Shocking details. Worse, the Titanic had adequate launching gear to deploy 64 wooden lifeboats. These would have transported a total of 4,000 people, more than the maximum number of passengers and crew, which was 3,547. However, the White Star Line reached the disastrous conclusion that 20 lifeboats were sufficient. A change in the rules. However, this judgment didn't violate any regulations. According to British maritime regulations, any ship weighing more than 10,000 tons, such as the Titanic, was only required to carry 16 lifeboats, with a total capacity of 990. Naturally, subsequent investigations would concentrate on the flaws of this statistic. A sad celebration. In any event, when the RMS Titanic set sail on May 31, 1911, she was up to code. A gathering of 100,000 people have witnessed this magnificent occurrence. The enormous ship fell into the Lagan River in under 62 seconds. The Titanic was then the biggest built item floating on water anywhere in the world. Despite the fact that the ship's launch was a cause for enormous joy, tragedy overshadowed the occasion. Bad omen. Shipwright James Dobbin was among those who knocked down the massive timbers that sustained the ship before it reached the ocean. One of the enormous boards collapsed on Dobbin in the process. He died 2 days later from his injuries, and in retrospect, it's all too tempting to view this as a terrible portent. Work to do. Even when the Titanic's hull was in the water, there was still a lot of work to be done. The next year was spent completing the interior and installing numerous superstructure components, including fitting the ship's characteristic set of 4 tunnels. Only 3 of these discharged motor fumes, the other provided ventilation for the kitchens. Trials at sea. Following the fit-out, the Titanic underwent a series of sea trials, which started on April 2, 1912. There were just 8 days before the ship was scheduled to depart from Southampton on her first trip. And happily for everyone involved, the ship was found to be entirely oceanworthy after being tested in the Irish Sea. Maiden voyage. So, on her first trip to America's East Coast, the Titanic set sail from Southampton, pausing briefly at Cherbourg and Queenstown. Edward Smith, the most senior captain of the White Star Line, assumed command of the new ship and her crew of 885 people, 23 of whom were women. 66 workers were on the deck, while 325 worked below as engineers and stokers. It takes a village. A total of 494 crew members were on board to assist the guests in some way. To feed the passengers, there were fishmongers, cooks, butchers, bakers, and waiters. Dishwashers, laundrymen, bed makers, and cleaners maintained everything in order, while a printer printed the Atlantic Daily Bulletin, a daily newspaper. There were also 8 musicians on board. Limited capacity. In terms of passengers, 709 rode in third class, commonly known as steerage, 284 in second class, and 324 in first class. The passengers included 896 men, 447 women, and 107 children. The majority of them were in steerage. While the Titanic had a capacity of 2,453 passengers, only 1,317 were on board for the first voyage. A curious explanation. In normal conditions, the White Star Line would have anticipated such a ship to be full, particularly on her first voyage. But there's an explanation. You see, there had been a massive coal strike in the United Kingdom. This disrupted travel plans and forced many others to rearrange their plans. Famous passengers. Those who did board the Titanic, however, included some very wealthy people. To begin with, there was super-rich American billionaire Benjamin Guggenheim, who arrived with his butler, chauffeur, lover, Leontinine Albert, and her maid. Then there was John Jacob Astor IV and his wife Madeline, who were opulently rich. Unfortunately, Guggenheim, his butler, and his chauffeur all died as a result of the iceberg's impact, as did Astor. First-class guests. Isidor Strauss, the owner of Macy's department store, and his wife Ida were also on board, but neither survived. As a consequence of the ship's demise, Canadian industrialist and politician Harry Molson also died. Ismay, who undoubtedly had some input into the number of lifeboats on board the Titanic, escaped the sinking. Lucky escape. Yes, Ismay entered the final lifeboat released from the starboard side of the ship. Many afterwards accused him of cowardice. Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, was not so fortunate. He died in the sinking after assisting others to escape. J.P. Morgan, the final owner of White Star, was possibly the most fortunate. He was supposed to be a passenger on the Titanic's first voyage, but he changed his mind at the last minute. Frozen menace. Of course, the majority of individuals who perished were neither affluent nor renowned, since the devastating iceberg had no regard for social class or financial status. At 11:40 p.m. on April 14, 1912, crewman Frederick Fleet observed the frozen threat for the first time. While urgent efforts were made to divert the ship away, there was too little time to reverse direction, which meant the Titanic would slam right into the ice. The catastrophic collision. The lowering of the bows was the first indication that the ship was doomed. This angled the Titanic, worsening the passage of water through her hull. On the crippled ship, chaos ensued, with inadequately trained crewmen deploying lifeboats that were only partly filled. To make things worse, several of the passengers in the steerage section were stuck below deck. Sinking the unsinkable. And at roughly 2:10 a.m. on April 15th, the Titanic had begun to sink rapidly. Within 5 minutes, the stern, the final component of the vessel visible above the water, was submerged under the waves. Those unfortunate folks who had been clinging to the back end were thrown into the frigid seas, where they died of exposure. Not the end of the story. But despite the fact that the unsinkable Titanic was lost in this calamity, her tale was far from over. Understandably, the shocked people wanted explanations as to how this inconceivable catastrophe could have occurred, and investigations in both the United Kingdom and the United States yielded some results. There were too few lifeboats. Captain Smith, who perished in the disaster, paid too little heed to iceberg warnings, and the ship sailed too fast. Completely lost. Whatever the cause, the Titanic was entirely destroyed. Her whereabouts under the sea were unknown. Soon after she went down, the families of some of the wealthy victims gathered funds to search for the disaster. This scheme was bound to fail, since diving equipment at the time couldn't reach the depths where the vessel lay. Another heinous notion was to detonate dynamite aboard the ship, causing corpses to rise to the surface. A race for rescue. Of course, this was completely unrealistic, since no one knew where the Titanic's ruins were. Other plans involved elevating the wreck with massive magnets and transporting it to the surface using balloons. The oddest concept, though, was offered in the 1970s. The idea was to fill the hull with ping pong balls and float the shattered vessel to the surface. 70 years later. After more than 70 years, a French-American team using a remotely operated submarine named Argo discovered the wreck. Further human submarines visited the Titanic in the years that followed, and the most recent trip took place in 2005. New information. And so we return to the crew of the mini-submarine Limiting Factor. You'll recall that we last saw them at a depth of 12,500 feet, staring at the shattered remnants of the Titanic. Using the high-tech 4K cameras aboard their ship, the crew was also able to capture some spectacular photographs. Deeply shocking. Victor Vescovo, a diver and the CEO of Caladan Oceanic, led this voyage in August 2019, which was the first of its kind in about 15 years. Vescovo was also one of the people who took part in Limiting Factor's 5 dives. Parks Stevenson, a Titanic history specialist, and Rob McCallum, the chief planner, were also on the team. And what the brave explorers discovered at the wreck was frightening. Disappearing ship. The Titanic, you see, is vanishing all too swiftly, and Patrick Leahy, expedition participant and president of Limiting Factor owner Triton Submarines, confirmed this in a Triton news statement. Leahy claims that witnessing the Titanic's decomposition by the ocean and return to its elemental state while serving as a haven for a remarkable variety of animals was the expedition's most fascinating aspect. Vanished. Much has also disappeared. A well-known relic known as the Captain's Bathtub is no longer on display at the site. However, what remains of the ship, as well as the abundant underwater species that live on the ruin, have been brilliantly captured in the 4K film that the divers were able to take. Stunning footage. Stevenson also stressed the ship's condition in 2019, telling the BBC, "The Titanic is returning to nature. Strong ocean currents, the corrosive effects of seawater, and microorganisms that consume metal all contribute to the loss of the ship's wreck." Disintegrating. But given that the Titanic has been submerged for nearly a century, her decomposition should come as no surprise. Claire Fitzsimmons, expedition biologist, noted, "There are microbes on the shipwreck that are eating away the iron of the wreck itself and creating rustical structures, which is a much weaker form of the metal." In danger. Unfortunately, when disturbed, rubble disintegrates into dust, putting the Titanic at risk of sinking. The ship, along with all who perished on board, looked to be gradually disintegrating into the water in which it sank over a century ago. While the Titanic is perhaps the most renowned, it isn't the only wreckage that continues to amaze and frighten experts.